In the heart of Stardew Valley, where the soil remembers ancient things and the trees hold whispers of forgotten days, there exist creatures who bridge the space between the visible world and the magic that hums beneath it all. They are small, no larger than a plump apple, and they wear colors that shift like emotions through the spectrum of nature itself. Green like new leaves, blue like twilight, golden like autumn sun filtering through branches, purple like shadow-dappled forest floors. The people of Pelican Town call them Junimos, though most residents have never seen one with their own eyes. To the townsfolk, they are fairy tales, the subject of children's television programs and arcade games, creatures from old legends that grandmothers might have whispered about on winter nights. There is even a book in Penny's room lying open on her desk titled Fairies, Junimos, and Other Fables. The title alone tells you everything about how the valley has forgotten its own magic, how the extraordinary has been filed away into the category of make-believe, safely contained between the pages of storybooks where it cannot challenge the mundane rhythms of daily life. But forgetting does not make something less real. It only makes it more patient. Long before there was a Pelican Town, before there were farms carved from wilderness or mine carts running through mountain tunnels, before the first human settlers arrived with their tools and their ambitions, Stardew Valley belonged to the forest. The trees were older then, their roots reaching deeper, their canopies forming cathedrals of green shadow where sunlight fell in pillars of gold. In those days, the magic of the valley was not something hidden or rare. It simply was, as fundamental as rain, as ordinary as birdsong. The ancient texts speak of Yoba, the endless golden light that existed before time itself. Yoba swirled that light into a vortex, and from the eye of that vortex sprang a seed. Yoba smoothed the golden light until it became soil, and into that soil planted the seed. The vine that grew from it twisted skyward for 11 days before bearing fruit, and when Yoba peeled back the skin of that fruit, the world tumbled out. This is how creation began, according to the book of Yoba, whose highlights can be found in the museum library for anyone curious enough to read them. But what the creation story does not explicitly say, what must be read between the lines of ancient wisdom, is that the world Yoba revealed was not merely rock and water, not simply soil and sky. It was a living thing, threaded through with intention, woven from magic as much as matter. And in the forests, particularly in the deep woods where the light falls green and the air tastes of moss and mushrooms, guardians emerged to tend the places where that original magic pooled most strongly. The Junimos are those guardians, keepers of the forest, as some old legends name them, spirits that live with the trees, bound to the rhythm of seasons and the health of the land. They do not age as humans understand aging, do not measure their existence in years, but in cycles, in the turning of leaves from green to gold to gone. They have witnessed centuries pass like a farmer might watch a single day, patient and attentive, noting the changes with the careful attention of creatures who understand that everything is connected, that a single damaged root can affect an entire ecosystem, that magic and nature are not separate things, but two names for the same truth. Their language reflects this nature. The Junimo script, preserved in golden scrolls and ancient carvings, appears at first glance to be merely decorative,
a series of flowing symbols that might ornament the margin of an illuminated manuscript. But it is, in fact, a functional language, a substitution cipher where each symbol corresponds to a letter in the common tongue. The symbols themselves carry meaning beyond their phonetic value. They are rooted in nature, in growth and season, in the visual language of the forest, where a bent branch or a cluster of mushrooms can tell a story to anyone who has learned to read the wilderness. When the Junimos write, they inscribe messages like, "We, the Junimo, are happy to aid you. In return, we ask for gifts of the valley. If you are one with forest magic, then you will see the true nature of this scroll." There is a simplicity to their communication, a directness that speaks to their nature. They do not engage in deception or elaborate rhetoric. They state their purpose, make their request, and explain the condition for understanding. It is the language of creatures who have no need for manipulation, because they operate on a level of reality where intentions matter more than words, where the exchange of energy and effort creates bonds stronger than any contract.
For most of recorded history, the Junimos remained in their forests, tending the hidden places, ensuring the continued flow of magic through the valley's veins. They watched as humans arrived, cleared land, built structures, planted crops in neat rows that bore no resemblance to the wild profusion of the forest. They watched as the settlement that would become Pelican Town took root, as generations lived and died, as the old ways were slowly forgotten and the magic faded from common knowledge until it became legend, then myth, then mere story. The humans built a community center. It was, in its time, a remarkable building, a place where the townspeople gathered to celebrate, to make decisions, to strengthen the bonds that held their society together. The structure itself was solid, constructed with care, featuring a grand hall with a fireplace whose mantel could hold stars. There were rooms for different purposes, spaces dedicated to the crafts and trades that sustained the community, a place for those who worked with their hands, a pantry for those who grew food, a vault for managing the town's finances, a place dedicated to fishing, to the harvest from river and ocean, a place for mining and foraging, and a bulletin board where announcements could be posted, where the needs of the community could be made visible. For years, decades perhaps, the community center thrived. It was the beating heart of Pelican Town, the place where individual lives wove together into something larger than themselves. But something happened, though no one alive can quite remember the details. Perhaps it was economic pressure from the outside world. Perhaps it was simply the slow entropy that affects all institutions when attention wanes and maintenance is deferred. Perhaps the younger generations found less meaning in gathering together, preferring instead to pursue their own private ambitions. Whatever the cause, the community center began to empty. The gatherings became less frequent. The rooms fell silent. The fireplace went cold. Dust accumulated on surfaces that had once been kept pristine. The building's grand clock, which had once kept perfect time, frozen at some forgotten hour. The structure remained standing, but it was no longer alive in the way that buildings can be alive when they are filled with purpose and people. It became a shell, an artifact, a reminder of something that had been but was no longer. And then, at some point in this decline, the Junimos moved in. It is not entirely clear why. The community center, for all its emptiness, was not in the forest. It stood at the heart of human habitation, surrounded by homes and shops, far from the secret woods and the deep groves where the Junimos typically made their dwelling. But perhaps that was precisely the point. Perhaps they recognized that the community center, in its original form, had been a place of genuine community, of connection, of people coming together to support one another. Perhaps they saw in its abandonment a symbol of something larger, a disconnection not just between people, but between people and the land, between the present and the magic that had once been commonplace. Or perhaps they simply sensed that something was needed, that the valley itself was calling for restoration, that the balance was tilting dangerously toward fragmentation and forgetting. The Junimos are not driven by human logic or motivations. They respond to deeper currents, to the underlying patterns that connect all living things. They felt the disturbance, recognized the need, and took up residence in the hope that someone, someday, would be able to see them and understand what they offered. They waited in the dimness of the community center, invisible to most eyes, dismissed as rats by those who caught glimpses of movement in the shadows. They waited while the building continued its slow deterioration, while vines crept through cracks in the foundation, while rain found its way through compromised roofing, while the paint peeled and the floorboards creaked. They waited with the patience of beings who measure time differently, who understand that seeds can lie dormant for years before conditions align for sprouting.
Meanwhile, far away in a city whose name hardly matters, a different kind of decline was underway. A person sat at a desk in a cubicle, one worker among hundreds in a massive office building that belonged to Joja Corporation. The fluorescent lights hummed their endless monotone song. The computer screen cast its pale glow. The work was meaningless, the kind of task that produces nothing tangible, that moves numbers from one column to another without creating anything new or valuable. Day after day passed in this fashion, each one indistinguishable from the last, until time itself seemed to congeal into a single endless moment of soul-crushing tedium. This person, the one who would eventually become known simply as the farmer, was not special in any obvious way. They were simply someone who had been crushed by the weight of modern life, someone whose spirit had been ground down by the relentless machinery of corporate efficiency. They were drowning in the tide of their own existence, suffocating under expectations and obligations that meant nothing to anyone, least of all themselves. And then they remembered a letter. Years ago, on his deathbed, their grandfather had given them an envelope with strict instructions not to open it until they felt truly crushed by the burden of life, until their spirit had begun to fade. The old man had known somehow that this moment would come. He had prepared for it.
Inside the envelope was a deed to his old farm in Stardew Valley, along with a letter explaining that the property had belonged to him, that it now belonged to them, that if they needed an escape from the life that was destroying them, they could go there. The farm was overgrown, certainly. It would require tremendous effort to restore, but it was theirs, a place where they could build a new life according to their own values, their own pace, their own relationship with the land and the community around them. The decision was made almost before it was conscious. They quit their job at Joja Corporation. They packed what little they needed. They boarded a bus that carried them through changing landscapes, from the steel and concrete of the city to rolling hills, and then to the valley itself, where the air smelled different, where the light felt softer, where a whole different kind of life was possible. The bus stopped in front of a small house on an overgrown plot of land. The mayor, Lewis, was there to greet them, along with Robin, the carpenter. They were welcoming but clearly surprised that anyone would actually want to take on such a challenge. The farm had been abandoned since the grandfather's passing. Nature had reclaimed it enthusiastically. The fields were thick with debris, with stones and stumps and wild grass. The infrastructure had fallen into disrepair. It would take seasons of dedicated effort just to make the place functional again. But the new farmer looked at the land and saw not an overwhelming task, but a possibility. This was not a cubicle or a meaningless job. This was soil and sky, work that would produce tangible results, effort that would feed not just the body, but the spirit. They rolled up their sleeves and began the long, slow process of transformation. Days turned to weeks as they cleared the land, planted their first crops, learned the rhythms of agriculture. They began to know their neighbors, the people of Pelican Town, each with their own stories and struggles and dreams. They discovered the mines where valuable ore could be extracted from the depths. They learned to fish in the river that ran through cindersap forest. Slowly, piece by piece, they built a new life that felt, for the first time in years, genuinely meaningful. And then, on a sunny day in spring, sometime after the 5th day of their arrival, they walked into town at just the right moment. Somewhere between 8 in the morning and 1 in the afternoon, they came through from the bus stop into the main square of Pelican Town. Mayor Lewis was there, and something in his expression suggested this was not a coincidental meeting. He had been waiting for them, or for the right moment, or perhaps for both. "Come with me," Lewis said. "I want to show you something."
He led them to the old community center, a building they had noticed before but never entered. It stood impressive, even in its dilapidation, its architecture speaking of a time when such things were built to last, built to inspire. Lewis produced a key, worked the lock, and pushed open the heavy front doors. They stepped inside together, their footsteps echoing in the emptiness. The interior was dimmer than they expected, the windows dirty and obscured. Dust motes danced in the shafts of light that managed to penetrate. The space felt abandoned, sad, like a grand ballroom the morning after a party when all the guests have gone home and all that remains is debris and silence. Lewis began talking about the building's history, about how it had once been the heart of the town, how he hoped someone might eventually restore it, though he admitted he had no idea how such a thing could be accomplished. And then they saw them. A flash of color in the corner of their eye, a sense of movement where there should be none. Small figures, impossible figures, creatures that looked like living fruit,
round and bright and somehow more real than anything else in the room. Green ones, blue ones, golden ones. They appeared for just a moment, bouncing with an excited energy, their presence unmistakable. And then they vanished. The farmer turned to Louis, about to mention what they had seen, but the mayor was talking about rats. He wouldn't be surprised if the place was full of rats, he said. They'd have to be dealt with eventually. He made no mention of the small, colorful creatures that had just been clearly visible in the room. It became immediately apparent that to Louis, the community center was just an empty building with a pest problem. But the farmer had seen something else entirely. After Louis left, the farmer returned to the community center alone. They wandered through the rooms, examining the space more carefully now that they knew something extraordinary was present. In the lower left room, they found something remarkable. A golden scroll mounted on the wall, covered in symbols that flowed and curved like vines, like water, like things alive and growing. The symbols meant nothing to them, a cipher without a key, beautiful but incomprehensible. They reached out and touched the scroll, feeling the texture of its surface, the slight warmth it retained as though recently held, and in touching it, they made themselves known. They announced, without words, their presence and their interest. They indicated that they could see what others could not, that they were aware of the magic that still lingered in this place. The next morning, a letter arrived. It came from someone who signed himself simply as M. Rasmodius, though most people knew him by a different name, the Wizard. The letter was brief but urgent. It spoke of a rat problem at the community center, though the Wizard's tone suggested he knew perfectly well that rats were not the issue. He requested a visit to his tower, which stood in the western reaches of Cindersap Forest, accessible by a path that led away from Marnie's ranch into the deeper woods. The farmer found the tower that same day. It was an impressive structure, rising from the forest like something from a medieval fairy tale, a stone cylinder topped with a conical roof, looking distinctly out of place among the natural surroundings, yet somehow also perfectly suited to them. Rasmodius himself was exactly what one might expect from a wizard, robed and bearded and carrying himself with the gravity of someone who regularly handles forces beyond normal comprehension. He wasted no time on pleasantries. "You have seen them," he said, not a question, a statement of fact. "The Junimos, the forest spirits who have taken residence in the community center. Most people cannot perceive them. Their eyes have forgotten how to see magic, how to recognize what exists beyond the purely physical. But you can see them, which means you have the potential to help them." The wizard explained that the Junimos wanted to restore the community center. They had the power to repair it, to return it to its former glory. But they required something in exchange. They needed offerings from the valley, items that represented the land's bounty and diversity. They needed someone who could move between the human world and their own, someone who could gather these gifts and present them as bundles, organized offerings that would satisfy specific needs. "But first," Rasmodius said, "you must be able to communicate with them properly. You must learn to read their language." He produced a small vial containing a luminous liquid that seemed to contain its own light. This was a potion, he explained, infused with forest magic, the same magic that flows through the trees and the soil, through the deep places where the Junimos make their home. By drinking it, the farmer would gain the ability to understand the Junimo language, to read their golden scrolls, to perceive the bundles they requested. The farmer drank the potion without hesitation. It tasted of green things, of bark and leaves and morning dew, of sunshine filtered through a canopy and rain soaking into rich earth. The effect was immediate and subtle at once. They felt no dramatic transformation, no surge of power. Instead, it was as though a veil they hadn't realized was there had been gently lifted. The world looked the same, but they could perceive more of it now, could sense the connections that run beneath the surface of things, the network of life and energy that binds all things together. When they returned to the community center, the golden scroll in the lower left room was no longer incomprehensible. The symbols resolved into letters, the letters into words, the words into meaning. "We, the Junimo, are happy to aid you," the scroll read. "In return, we ask for gifts of the valley. If you are one with forest magic, then you will see the true nature of this scroll." Below the message was a diagram that looked like a tree with branches extending outward, each branch ending in a circular space. These were the bundles, the offerings the Junimos requested. The crafts room bundle was first, requiring items produced by artisans, maple syrup, with sweet sap of trees rendered down through careful tending, oak resin harvested from tapped oaks, pine tar from pine trees, ooze from the mines, that strange substance produced by certain slimes, and more. Each item representing a different facet of valley life, a different skill or trade or knowledge. The farmer understood the task immediately. This was not simply about gathering items. It was about engaging the valley comprehensively, about learning to fish and forage, to mine and farm, to craft and process, to transform raw materials into finished goods. It was about becoming part of the valley's ecosystem, about understanding how everything connects, how the health of the forest affects the fish in the river, how the quality of the soil determines the value of the harvest, how human effort can work in harmony with natural cycles rather than against them. They set to work with determination that surprised even themselves. Days passed in a blur of activity. They chopped trees and tapped them for their sap products. They descended into the mines, fighting slimes and gathering ore and strange materials from the underground darkness. They planted seasonal crops, tending them through their growth cycles, harvesting at peak ripeness. They fished in different waters at different times, learning which fish appeared when and where. They foraged in the forest, gathering mushrooms and berries and wild plants that grew without human cultivation. And slowly, methodically, they completed the first bundle. It took time, required learning new skills, demanded patience and persistence. But when they finally gathered all the required items and brought them to the community center, placing each one in its designated slot on the golden scroll, something remarkable happened. A Junimo appeared, no longer shy or fleeting. It bounced over to the completed bundle with obvious excitement, its movements expressing a joy that needed no translation. It wrapped what might have been arms around the collection of items and carried them, impossibly, toward a small leafy hut that stood near the left corner of the main hall. The bundle, despite being larger than the Junimo itself, was transported with ease, as though the normal rules of physics held no authority over these creatures. As a reward for the completion, the farmer received items useful for their farm, tools or seeds or resources that would make their work easier. But the real reward was what happened next. The scroll glowed with a new radiance, and additional rooms in the community center suddenly became accessible. The pantry opened, requesting bundles of crops that showcased the valley's agricultural potential. The fish tank requested specimens from different waters. The boiler room wanted ores and metals from the mines. The vault, notably, simply wanted large sums of gold, the raw financial capacity to fund other repairs. Each room, each bundle, represented a different aspect of community life. The pantry spoke to the farming tradition that fed everyone. The fish tank acknowledged those who drew sustenance from the waters. The boiler room represented the crafters and smiths who worked with metal. The crafts room celebrated artisans. The bulletin board, which would appear after completing 3 other bundles, represented community requests, the small needs of individual townspeople that contributed to the collective well-being. The farmer threw themselves into the work. Seasons passed, each one bringing new crops, new fish, new possibilities. They learned to recognize the slight differences between similar items, to understand which fish appeared in which seasons, to know instinctively when a crop was ready for harvest. They became intimately familiar with the valley's rhythms, its cycles, its moods. They learned that spring brings rain and new growth, that summer burns hot and bright, that fall paints the world in golds and reds before winter arrives to rest the land beneath snow and silence. With each completed bundle, the Junimos performed their magic. At night, after the farmer had gone to sleep, they would work their restoration. These were not simple repairs, not the kind of work that could be accomplished with hammer and nails. The Junimos worked with magic, with intention, with a power that came from their deep connection to the living world. They would focus their energy on a specific task, and by morning, something significant would have changed. When all the bundles in the crafts room were complete, the farmer woke to discover that a bridge had been repaired. The quarry, which had been inaccessible due to a collapsed bridge to the east of the mines, was now open. Large rocks containing ore regularly appeared there, a gift from the depths of the earth, resources that would have been impossibly difficult to obtain otherwise. The Junimos had reached out to the world itself and asked it to provide, and the world, recognizing their authority, had obliged. When the pantry bundles were finished, the dilapidated greenhouse on the farmer's property was restored. One morning they woke to find it transformed, its glass panels replaced, its structure sound, its soil ready for planting. A greenhouse meant crops could grow year-round, regardless of season, meant that winter no longer forced complete agricultural dormancy, meant the farm could be dramatically more productive. The Junimos had given not just a building, but a fundamental expansion of what was possible. The completion of the boiler room bundles repaired the old mine carts that connected different areas of the valley. Suddenly, travel between distant locations became nearly instantaneous. The farmer could zip from their farm to the mines, from the mines to town, from town to the quarry, all in moments rather than the long walks that had previously been necessary. The valley, once a place of isolation, with each location separated by real distance and effort, became more connected, more accessible, easier to move through. The fish tank, when complete, caused the removal of a massive boulder that had been blocking a mountain stream. Water from deep within the mountain began flowing into the lake, bringing with it precious metals and materials that could be panned from the shallows. Willie, the local fisherman, provided a copper pan and taught the farmer how to use it, adding another skill to their growing repertoire, another way to harvest the valley's abundance. The vault, perhaps most remarkably, led to the repair of the bus that connected Pelican Town to the Calico Desert. The bus had been out of service for years, leaving the desert inaccessible. But with enough financial resources gathered and offered, the Junimos arranged for its restoration. Pam, who had been the bus driver before service stopped, could work again. The farmer gained access to an entirely new region, to different crops and fish and resources, to new possibilities and challenges.
Throughout this process, the community center transformed. Rooms that had been dark and dusty began to gleam. The fireplace in the main hall roared to life, its mantle holding stars that appeared each time a room's bundles were completely finished. These stars were not decorative. They were markers of progress, symbols of restoration. And each time one appeared, a Junimo would take it from the leafy hut and place it carefully on the mantle. Then, and this was perhaps the most delightful detail, that Junimo would follow the farmer around the community center for a while, bouncing along behind them like a small, loyal companion, clearly pleased with what had been accomplished. The Junimos themselves became more visible, more active. When the farmer entered the community center, they would often appear, bouncing with excitement, making soft sounds that seemed to express happiness or encouragement or gratitude. They were not simply using the farmer as a tool. They were building a relationship, establishing trust, showing in their own way that this was a partnership, a collaboration between human effort and forest magic. Occasionally, the farmer would catch glimpses of the Junimos at work. Late at night, after completing all the bundles in a room, a cutscene would play. The farmer would watch as dozens of Junimos appeared, far more than had been visible during the day. They would work together with remarkable efficiency, their small bodies moving in coordination, their magic pooling and focusing. And by morning, something significant would have changed in the valley. A greenhouse restored, a bridge repaired, mine carts functional. Each transformation was a gift, a reward for the effort invested, proof that the partnership was genuine and reciprocal. The townspeople noticed the changes, but did not always understand their source. Mayor Lewis was delighted that various infrastructure problems were being resolved, but couldn't quite explain how. Robin, the carpenter, was surprised to find buildings repaired that she hadn't been hired to fix. Pam was grateful to be working again, but uncertain about exactly who had arranged for the bus's restoration. The magic was working, but it remained largely invisible to those who lacked the capacity or willingness to see it. But the farmer saw. They understood what was happening, understood that the Junimos were keeping their promise,
that the gifts of the valley were being transformed through forest magic into the restoration of community infrastructure. They understood that what they were doing was not simply a strange quest or an arbitrary collection task. They were participating in something profound, in the reweaving of connections that had been severed, in the restoration of balance between human activity and the natural world. And then, finally, after seasons of dedicated effort, after harvesting every crop, and catching every fish, and mining every ore, and crafting every artisan good, and foraging every wild plant, after giving everything the valley had to offer back to the valley itself in the form of completed bundles, the last item was placed. The final bundle was finished. All the rooms complete. All the stars on the mantle. The community center fully restored. That night, something extraordinary happened. The Junimos appeared in greater numbers than ever before, their colors brilliant in the darkness, their magic reaching a crescendo. They worked through the night with focused intensity, and the building itself responded. The walls straightened and cleaned themselves. The floors gleamed. The windows sparkled. The clock on the building's exterior, frozen for so long, suddenly began to tick again, its hands moving to catch up with real time, its chimes ringing out across the sleeping town. And then, as dawn approached, the Junimos gathered in the main hall. The farmer was somehow there to witness it, pulled into the scene as though by invitation. The Junimos formed a circle, and there was a sense of completion, of something finished, of a task accomplished. They had done what they came to do. The community center was restored. The valley had been reminded of what was possible when people worked together, when effort was given freely and received with gratitude, when the connection between humans and the living world was honored rather than ignored. And then, one by one, the Junimos began to disappear, not dying, not ending, but returning to the forest, to the secret woods, to the places where they properly belonged. They had been called by a need, had taken up residence to facilitate a healing, and now that the healing was complete, they could go home. They had never intended to stay permanently in a human building. That had only ever been temporary, a necessary intervention, a bridge between what was and what could be. The farmer stood alone in the restored community center, feeling both triumphant and oddly sad. They had grown fond of the Junimos, had come to enjoy their presence, had appreciated their bouncing enthusiasm and their clear delight in the partnership. But they understood that this was right, that the Junimos belonged in the forest, that their work in the human world was done. The next sunny day, the town gathered for a ceremony. Mayor Lewis organized the event, inviting everyone to celebrate the restoration of the community center. Balloons were tied to posts, a buffet was laid out. People mingled and talked and marveled at the building's transformation. They walked through rooms that gleamed, admired the working fireplace, noticed details that had been invisible under years of neglect. There was a sense of collective pride, of community accomplishment, even though most of them didn't fully understand how the restoration had been achieved. The mayor made a speech thanking the farmer for their contribution, acknowledging that somehow, through their efforts, this impossible task had been accomplished. He presented them with the Stardew Valley trophy, a recognition of their service to the town. The ceremony unlocked an achievement, the local legend designation that marked them as someone who had fundamentally changed the valley for the better. But something else happened too, something that would take longer to fully manifest. With the community center restored, Joja Corporation's hold on the town began to weaken. Jojamart, which had been gradually expanding its influence, offering convenient shopping at the cost of local character and autonomy, suddenly seemed less necessary. People remembered what it felt like to have a genuine community, to gather together not as consumers but as neighbors. The corporate veneer began to crack. Within days, Jojamart closed. Morris, the store manager who had been pushing so hard for the town to abandon the community center in favor of Joja's development plan, left town. The building became abandoned, falling into the same kind of disrepair that had once afflicted the community center. But this abandonment was different. This was not a community space neglected. This was a corporate intrusion rejected. Pierre's General Store, which had been closed on Wednesdays to compete with Jojamart's hours, began opening every day of the week. Clint, the blacksmith, who had often felt underappreciated, began closing on Fridays to spend time at the restored community center. The fabric of town life adjusted, reshaping itself around the renewed center, finding new rhythms and patterns that honored both tradition and change. But the Junimos were not entirely gone from the farmer's life. There was more to the story, another chapter that would unfold through an odd sequence of events involving the wizard, a witch, and a goblin who blocked the way to a swamp. Through completing the Goblin Problem Quest, the farmer gained access to new magical buildings, structures that could be placed on their farm. And among these was something remarkable: the Junimo hut. A Junimo hut was exactly what it sounded like: a small dwelling crafted from natural materials designed to house Junimos. When placed on the farm, within range of planted crops, Junimos would come. They would emerge each morning from the hut, 3 of them at a time, and they would harvest crops that were ready, gathering them with the same efficiency they had shown in the community center. They moved through the fields like small, colorful blessings, working tirelessly, but never seeming tired, collecting ripe produce and storing it in the hut for the farmer to gather at their convenience. This was a different kind of partnership than the community center bundles. Here, there were no specific requests, no predetermined offerings. The Junimos simply helped with the harvest, taking on the most time-consuming aspect of farming, the daily collection of ripe produce. In return, they asked for nothing except, apparently, raisins. The Junimo hut's catalog mentioned that raisins were the Junimos' favorite food, though whether this was payment or simply preference was never entirely clear. The Junimos who came to live in the farm huts were not the same ones who had occupied the community center, or perhaps they were, but rotated in shifts from the larger population. They maintained their shy nature, disappearing quickly if approached too directly, bouncing away if the farmer tried to interact with them beyond the established arrangement. They did not work during rain or winter, respecting the rhythms of weather and season. They could not harvest giant crops, those impressive specimens that occasionally grew when the same crop type was planted in a 3x3 grid. They had limits, boundaries to their assistance, a clear sense of what they would and would not do. But within those limitations, they were invaluable. A farmer could plant crops much more densely when Junimos did the harvesting, because the Junimos could pass through tiles that would block a human. Trellised plants like hops and green beans, which normally required careful spacing to allow the farmer to reach them, could be planted in solid blocks if Junimos handled the harvest. The farm's productivity could increase dramatically, not through exploitation, but through collaboration, through working with magic rather than simply laboring against nature. The relationship with farm Junimos revealed something important about these creatures. They were not servants. They were not enslaved or coerced. They chose to help, offered their assistance freely, and could presumably leave if the arrangement was unsatisfactory. The Junimo hut had a toggle that allowed the farmer to turn the Junimo services on or off, which suggested a level of respect for their autonomy, an acknowledgement that this was a partnership that could be paused or ended. Throughout all of this, questions lingered. Who exactly were the Junimos? Where did they come from originally? What was their relationship to the forest, to the magic that permeated the valley, to the ancient entity Yoba, who supposedly created the world? The game offered hints, but few definitive answers, leaving space for wonder, for mystery, for the recognition that some things cannot be fully explained or categorized. The wizard, Rasmodius, clearly knew more than he said. He understood the Junimo language without needing the forest magic potion. He could facilitate communication between humans and forest spirits. He recognized immediately that the farmer had the potential to see the Junimos, suggesting some capacity for perceiving who could and who could not interact with magic. But when asked directly about the Junimos, he offered only basic information, treating them as a known quantity, as spirits whose existence required no special explanation.
This suggested that the Junimos were not unique to Stardew Valley, that they existed in other forests, other wild places, wherever the old magic still held sway. They were not the last of their kind or some rare species clinging to existence. They were simply the Junimos of this particular valley, doing what Junimos do, tending the balance between human activity and natural magic, offering help when properly approached, retreating when their work was done. The townspeople's relationship to the Junimos was revealing. Most could not see them, which raised questions about what it meant to perceive magic, about whether the inability to see was a personal failing or simply a consequence of living in a world that had forgotten how to recognize the extraordinary. Caroline, who managed Pierre's general store where the altar of Yoba stood, mentioned that the previous owners had built the altar room, that her family wasn't particularly religious but allowed others to use it. She did not seem to connect the worship of Yoba with the existence of forest spirits, did not draw lines between the creation deity and the creatures who tended the land that deity had allegedly created. Penny, the young teacher who educated the few children in town, kept a book about Junimos and fairies and other fabled beings. To her, they were stories, educational content, legends that might teach moral lessons but were not expected to be literally true. Sam, the musician, who sometimes worked part-time at Jojimart before its closure, composed music for a television show called The Happy Junimo Show, a program that apparently existed in the wider Ferngill Republic. This indicated that Junimos were known culturally, that they had entered popular consciousness as symbols or characters, even as actual encounters with real Junimos became increasingly rare. There was also an arcade game in the saloon called Junimo Kart,
in which a Junimo served as the playable character, navigating through side-scrolling challenges. The game was difficult, punishing, requiring precise timing and memorization of obstacle patterns. It seemed oddly disconnected from the real Junimos, who were helpful and kind, rather than frantically dodging hazards. But perhaps that was the point. Popular culture had taken the Junimo image and transformed it into something that fit the entertainment industry's needs, something that bore only superficial resemblance to the actual creatures. This gap between cultural representation and reality was significant. It suggested that the valley, and perhaps the wider world, had entered a phase where magic was remembered only as metaphor, where the extraordinary had been domesticated into stories and games and television shows, safely contained in forms that did not challenge the rational, material worldview that dominated modern thinking. The fact that the farmer could see the actual Junimos, could interact with them directly, could form a working partnership with them, marked them as someone who had not completely surrendered to that modern worldview, someone who retained or had recovered the capacity for wonder. The grandfather, whose farm the player inherited, must have known this. His letter, carefully sealed and given with instructions to open only when crushed by the burden of modern life, suggested he understood that the city would almost inevitably lead to that crushing, that the corporate world had no room for the kind of person who could perceive magic. By sending his grandchild back to the valley, he was offering more than just a farm. He was offering a chance to reconnect with something essential, something that had been lost or suppressed, but could be recovered in the right environment. The grandfather's shrine, which stood on the farm, and which his ghost visited on the first day of year 3 to evaluate the farmer's progress, suggested he maintained some connection to the valley even after death. He could see what the farmer accomplished, could assess whether they had truly integrated into the valley's life, whether they had formed genuine relationships with other people, whether they had mastered the various skills required for successful farming, mining, fishing, and foraging. The standards he applied were comprehensive, measuring success not just financially, but socially, practically, and perhaps spiritually. Did the grandfather know about the Junimos? Could he see them during his life? The game never explicitly confirms this, but the evidence suggests he must have. He understood the valley's magic, left his farm to someone who could potentially perceive it, arranged for them to arrive at precisely the moment when the Junimos needed human help. It was all too perfectly aligned to be coincidence. The grandfather, in his own way, was facilitating a connection between generations, ensuring that the knowledge of the valley's true nature would not be entirely lost. The wizard's relationship with the Junimos raised additional questions. He could read their language without special preparation. He could brew potions that granted forest magic to others. He lived in a tower in Cindersap Forest, positioning himself at the boundary between human settlement and wilderness, serving as a bridge between worlds. His estranged wife had become a witch, suggesting that magic could take different forms, that practitioners could choose different paths. The wizard seemed benevolent, helpful, invested in maintaining the valley's balance. The witch was portrayed as more antagonistic, though her actions were more mischievous than malicious, cursing chickens to lay void eggs, disrupting farms rather than destroying them. This dynamic between the wizard and the witch paralleled, in some ways, the dynamic between the community center restoration and Joja Corporation's plans. The wizard represented the old magic, the traditional approach, working with nature rather than against it. Joja represented pure efficiency, the subordination of everything to profit and growth, the corporate mindset that saw the valley primarily as an untapped market. The witch occupied an ambiguous middle ground, magical but antagonistic, disconnected, but not entirely absent. The war between the Ferngill Republic and the Gotoro Empire, mentioned occasionally in dialogue and hinted at through various details, suggested a larger world beyond the valley, a world engaged in conflicts that had little to do with magic or Junimos. Kent, one of the townspeople, was a soldier who returned from war after the first year, clearly traumatized by his experiences. The world beyond the valley was not peaceful or idyllic. It was torn by human conflicts, by the same kinds of struggles for power and resources that had always characterized human civilization. Against that backdrop, the valley itself appeared as a refuge, a place that had somehow maintained a different way of being. The Junimos were part of that difference, representatives of a worldview that prioritized balance and reciprocity, that understood the land as a living partner rather than a resource to be extracted. Their presence was not just magical, but also ethical, modeling a relationship with the world that the modern era had largely abandoned. The community center restoration, then, was not simply about fixing a building. It was about choosing a vision for how the valley would develop, about deciding whether Pelican Town would succumb to corporate homogenization or preserve its unique character. The Junimos made that choice possible by offering an alternative, by demonstrating that magic and community cooperation could achieve what money and efficiency could not. The alternative path, the Joja route, was always available. The farmer could purchase a Joja membership, turn the community center into a Joja warehouse, buy the town improvements directly rather than earning them through bundle completion. This path was faster in some ways, more straightforward, requiring only money rather than the comprehensive engagement with valley life that the bundles demanded. But it was also profoundly different in meaning. Buying improvements reinforced the transaction model, the idea that everything has a price and can be obtained through sufficient capital. Earning them through gifts to the Junimos reinforced the relationship model, the idea that value comes through reciprocity, through giving back to the land and the community. The game did not explicitly judge players for choosing the Joja route, though the emotional tone of that path was notably different. There was no magic, no wonder, no partnership with forest spirits, just business transactions and warehouse conversions. The infrastructure improvements were the same, but the meaning behind them was entirely different. One path led through magic and into deeper connection. The other led through money and into a more isolated, transactional existence. Most players, when aware of the choice, chose the Junimos. They chose wonder over efficiency, magic over money, relationship over transaction. This preference revealed something about what players wanted from the game, what they were seeking when they picked up Stardew Valley in the first place. They wanted connection. They wanted meaning. They wanted to participate in something that felt genuine and important, something that reminded them of values that the modern world often obscures or dismisses. The Junimos in this reading became symbols of a larger longing. They represented the possibility of a different way of living, a way that honored the land and maintained connection to the magic that flows through all things. They were not just characters or game mechanics. They were an invitation to imagine differently, to consider what might be possible if we approach the world with more wonder, more respect, more willingness to give without guarantee of immediate return. The fact that the Junimos remained somewhat mysterious only enhanced this symbolism. The game never fully explained them, never reduced them to simple mechanics or predictable behaviors. They remained other, separate, operating according to their own logic and purposes. This was appropriate. Mystery is essential to wonder. Full explanation would have diminished them, would have turned magic into mere mechanism. Eric Barone, the game's creator, known as Concerned Ape, designed Stardew Valley with remarkable attention to detail and emotional resonance. He created the game essentially alone over the course of more than 4 years, crafting every pixel of art, every note of music, every line of dialogue. He poured himself into the project, driven by a vision of what a farming game could be, how it could capture not just the mechanics of agriculture, but the feeling of building a life in a place that felt genuinely alive. In interviews, Barone has spoken about wanting the game to feel like a living world, wanting players to forget they were playing a game and instead feel immersed in a genuine place with genuine people. The Junimos were part of that vision, creatures that added a layer of magic and wonder to what might otherwise have been a purely realistic farming simulator. They transformed the game from being about efficient resource management into being about something larger, about restoration and connection, and the possibility of different ways of relating to the world. Barone drew inspiration from games like Harvest Moon, which he felt had grown progressively worse over time, losing sight of what made the early entries in that series special. He also drew from games like Animal Crossing, Rune Factory, Minecraft, and Terraria, each of which contributed different elements to Stardew Valley's design. But the Junimos were something specifically his, a creation that emerged from his own imagination and his own sense of what the valley needed. The development process was arduous. Barone worked on the game for years without any guarantee of success, supported by his girlfriend, surviving on minimal income, pouring every bit of his skill and passion into the project. He rewrote the code multiple times, redesigned systems, crafted and recrafted until everything felt right. The game was an act of faith, a commitment to a vision that existed only in his mind until he made it real through sustained effort. When Stardew Valley finally launched in February 2016, it became an immediate sensation. Players responded to it with overwhelming enthusiasm, buying millions of copies, creating vibrant communities around the game, producing fan art and mods and guides. The game resonated with something deep, filling a need that many people had felt but couldn't quite articulate. It offered escape from the corporate grind, from the meaningless labor that crushes so many modern lives. It offered a different vision, a different possibility, a chance to build something meaningful at a human scale. And the Junimos were central to that offering. They represented the magic that still exists in the world if we have eyes to see it, the partnerships that are possible if we approach the land with respect rather than exploitation, the wonder that awaits when we slow down enough to notice what exists beyond the obvious. They were small creatures with enormous symbolic weight, carrying meanings that extended far beyond their function as game characters. The community center restoration was emotional for many players precisely because it felt meaningful. It was not just a task to complete, but a narrative of healing, of bringing together a fractured community, of choosing connection over convenience. The Junimos facilitated that narrative, made it magical rather than merely practical, transformed what could have been a simple checklist into a journey of discovery and partnership. After the community center was restored, after the Junimos returned to the forest, players often reported feeling a sense of loss. They missed seeing the Junimos in the community center, missed the excitement of completing bundles and watching the small creatures bounce with joy, missed the sense of active partnership in a magical project. The Junimo huts on the farm helped fill that void, provided ongoing connection to these creatures, but it was not quite the same. The community center restoration was a story with a beginning, middle, and end. The Junimo farm companions were helpful companions, but no longer collaborators in a specific time-limited project. This emotional arc was intentional. Barone understood that meaningful stories require completion, that the Junimos could not stay in the community center forever without diminishing the significance of their presence. They came for a purpose, fulfilled that purpose, and returned home. This was the right ending, even if it left players wishing for more.
The broader lore of Stardew Valley positioned the Junimos within a larger, magical ecosystem. There were also fairies, occasionally glimpsed, blessing crops on the farm. There were dwarves, an ancient race with advanced technology, whose artifacts could be found throughout the valley. There were shadow people like Krobus, friendly despite appearances, living in the sewers and offering their own form of companionship. There were monsters in the mines, enemies that attacked, but also part of the valley's complex reality. There were hints of elemental wars in the distant past, conflicts between dwarves and elemental beings that had shaped the land. The Junimos fit into this as forest spirits, as guardians of a specific domain, as creatures tied to the trees and the growing things. They were not unique, but rather part of a larger category of magical beings, each type serving different functions, maintaining different balances. The fact that most humans could no longer see any of these creatures suggested a gradual decline in magical perception, a forgetting that had been ongoing for generations. The farmer's arrival in the valley represented a potential reversal of that decline. By seeing the Junimos, by forming a partnership with them, by completing the community center restoration, the farmer demonstrated that the connection was not permanently severed, that magic could still be perceived and engaged with, that the old ways were not irrevocably lost. They became a bridge between past and future, between the magical and the mundane, between the valley's ancient nature and its modern existence. This bridging role extended beyond just the Junimos. The farmer could befriend Krobus, could learn the dwarf language, could encounter fairies, could discover all the hidden magical elements scattered throughout the valley. They could access the witch's swamp, could obtain the wizard's buildings, could find secret notes that revealed hidden connections and buried truths. The valley revealed itself gradually to those willing to look, offering deeper and deeper layers of mystery and meaning to players who paid attention. The Junimos were often the first magical encounter, the initial revelation that the valley was more than it appeared. This positioning was significant. By introducing magic early, through creatures that were clearly benevolent and helpful,
The game established a tone of wonder rather than danger, of partnership rather than threat. The magic of Stardew Valley was generally kind, interested in connection and healing rather than power and domination. The Junimos embodied this perfectly. In the game's cultural representation within its own world, the Junimos had become somewhat domesticated. The Happy Junimo Show, the Junimo Kart arcade game, the various Junimo-themed furniture items available through the Junimo catalog. All these suggested that Junimos had entered popular imagination in sanitized, commercialized forms. They had become cute mascots, marketable characters, divorced from their actual nature as forest spirits with genuine magical power. This dynamic mirrored real-world trends, where indigenous creatures and cultural elements are often appropriated and commercialized, transformed into consumer goods that bear little resemblance to their origins. The game acknowledged this without heavy-handed commentary, simply presenting it as part of the world's reality. Actual Junimos existed, and most people couldn't see them, but images of Junimos were everywhere in commercial culture. The appearance was familiar, even as the reality was forgotten. The farmer's experience cut through this superficial familiarity. They encountered real Junimos, not cartoon versions or game characters. They formed actual relationships, engaged in genuine reciprocity, learned to see beyond the commercial representations to the living reality beneath. This was part of what made the community center restoration meaningful. It was not about consuming Junimo-themed products, but about actually working with these creatures, about being changed by the encounter.
The question of what happened to the Junimos after the community center restoration remained somewhat open. The game stated they returned to the forest. But which forest? The secret woods? That area in the northwestern corner of cinder-sapped forest, accessible only with a steel axe? The deeper wilderness beyond the mapped areas? Some other realm entirely, a spirit world that existed alongside the physical valley, but remained normally invisible. The fact that Junimos would come to live in farm huts suggested they had not left the valley entirely, that they remained available for continued partnership under the right circumstances. But the specific location of their primary dwelling remained mysterious, another detail left deliberately vague, maintaining the sense that these creatures existed partly beyond normal comprehension, that they occupied spaces and modes of being that human understanding could only partially grasp. This incompleteness was a feature, not a flaw. Mystery is essential to wonder. If everything about the Junimos was fully explained, if their origins and motivations and capabilities were completely laid out, they would lose much of their power. They worked best as beings who could be encountered and engaged with, but never fully known, who remained at least partly other, whose presence reminded players that the world contained more than could be easily categorized or understood. The Junimos' favorite food, being raisins, added a charming detail, a point of specificity that made them feel more real while also being slightly absurd. Why raisins? The game never explains. It simply presents it as fact, a quirk of these creatures' preferences, something players can accept without needing justification. This kind of detail, specific but unexplained, helped create a sense of the Junimos as beings with their own preferences and characteristics, not just game mechanics wearing a cute appearance. The way Junimos moved, bouncing rather than walking, contributed to their appeal. They did not move like humans or animals, but had their own distinct physics, their own way of traversing space that was both adorable and slightly alien. When they sped up if the players stood in their way in the community center, it suggested a kind of personality, a touch of playful behavior that made them feel alive rather than automated. The variety of Junimo colors added to the sense of them as a diverse population rather than a single entity. Green and blue and yellow and purple and more, each Junimo had its own appearance, suggesting individuality within the collective. They were not a hive mind or undifferentiated mass, but distinct beings who worked together, who collaborated with shared purpose but maintained separate existences. The golden scrolls they left with their carefully organized bundles showed a capacity for complex communication and organization. The Junimos understood the valley's economy, knew what crops grew when and where, recognized what items represented which aspects of valley life. They had been observing human activity, learning the patterns, understanding what would be needed for comprehensive restoration. This suggested intelligence and attention, an active engagement with the world around them rather than passive existence in forest isolation. Their magic was subtle in most contexts. They did not shoot lightning or transform into other shapes or demonstrate flashy supernatural powers during normal interactions. Instead, their magic was in the results, in bridges repaired overnight, in greenhouses restored, in minecarts fixed, in infrastructure improvements that appeared without visible mechanism. Their power was in creation and restoration, in healing and building, not in destruction or domination. This was magic as it perhaps should be, aligned with growth and health rather than control and violence. The overnight cutscenes where players could watch dozens of Junimos working together on major restoration projects revealed the scale of their actual capabilities. When they needed to accomplish something significant, they could pool their efforts and achieve results that would require months of human labor. But they only used this power for agreed-upon purposes, for tasks that had been earned through completing the appropriate bundles. They never used their magic coercively or for their own aggrandizement. Every act of restoration was a gift in response to gifts received. This reciprocity was central to understanding the Junimos. They operated on the principle of exchange, of balance, of maintaining equilibrium between giving and receiving. They would not restore the community center out of pure altruism, would not simply fix everything for free, but neither would they demand excessive payment or set impossible conditions. They asked for bundles that represented comprehensive engagement with the valley, gifts that showed respect for the land and its abundance.
By completing these bundles, the farmer proved themselves worthy of partnership. They showed they were not merely a consumer or exploiter, not someone who would take without giving back. They demonstrated understanding that the valley was a living system, that its health required care and attention, that value came through relationship rather than extraction. The Junimos recognized this demonstration and responded accordingly, with magic that transformed not just buildings, but possibilities. The philosophical underpinning here was profound.
The Junimos represented an alternative to the capitalist logic that dominated the modern world, the logic embodied by Joja Corporation. Where Joja saw everything in terms of price and profit, the Junimos operated on gift economy principles. Where Joja demanded money, the Junimos asked for offerings. Where Joja promoted efficiency and growth, the Junimos honored balance and reciprocity. Where Joja isolated individuals as consumers, the Junimos fostered community and connection. The choice between community center restoration and Joja development was really a choice between these worldviews. The farmer could participate in the gift economy, learning to see value in relationship and reciprocity, or they could remain within the transaction economy, where everything reduced to price and payment. Most players, when understanding this choice, opted for the gift economy, for the magic and wonder and connection that path offered. This preference suggested something important about what players wanted from games, and perhaps from life. Despite living in a world dominated by transaction logic, despite being constantly encouraged to think in terms of efficiency and profit, people responded powerfully to the alternative the Junimos represented. They wanted to believe that another way was possible, that magic was real, that reciprocity could work, that community could triumph over corporate power. Stardew Valley, through the Junimos and the community center restoration, offered that belief. It created a space where magic was real, where gifts mattered more than money, where individual effort combined with collective purpose could achieve transformative results. It was escapist, certainly, a retreat from harsh modern realities, but it was also aspirational, modeling values and relationships that players might carry back into their actual lives, even if the translation was imperfect. The Junimos, those small, bouncing, apple-shaped spirits, became ambassadors for this worldview. They demonstrated what reciprocity looked like, what partnership with the land could achieve, what happened when magic was honored rather than dismissed. They were humble messengers carrying a profound message, small creatures with large implications, forest spirits who reminded modern people of truths we had nearly forgotten. And when their work was done, when the community center gleamed with restored life and the town gathered to celebrate, the Junimos departed not in triumph, but in quiet completion. They had done what they came to do. The valley had been reminded, the connection had been re-established, the magic was visible once more to those willing to see. They returned to the forest, to the trees they had always tended, to the deep places where magic pools and waits, ready for the next time it might be needed, patient and persistent, and enduring as the roots beneath the soil, as the stars above the valley, as the ancient rhythms that continue regardless of whether anyone remembers to honor them.